I'm going to cover Stephanie Smallwood's Saltwater Slavery, a middle passage from Africa to American diaspora. Um, Smallwood uses diverse sources in an attempt to recreating the experience of the slave trade and the Middle Passage in her book, Saltwater Slavery. In fact, her point is to remove the term Middle Passage altogether and not even address the term. That this is a new way of looking at the dynamic as opposed to slavery having a beginning, middle, and therefore implied end. That this was a continuum of an event that was absolutely atrocious. She investigates the initial interaction and communication between Europeans and Africans that created the foundation of the trade and war sequences that Europeans turned the Middle Passage. She further investigates how merchants, traders, and sailors, buyers, and sellers of these human beings use capitalism to justify the associated system with inhumane violence and torture. It then takes us across the Atlantic to illustrate how Africans were turned into commodities. Now, commodification is the biggest part of this book. This book is one of the few that focus on the dynamic of how much, what was so unique about Western slavery. Commodification is the perfect word, just like saltwater slavery. She's putting these new terms in to invoke a truer or more accurate meaning. Whereas we say enslaved or the enslaved or slaves, a lot of people have dealt with that, the euphemistic language around slavery as to where she goes right into the heart of the matter and says that this is commodification. That capitalism was unique to North America in particular. But to the Western slavery, these people were practicing capitalism, not the Africans. You say, well, the Africans were doing it too. No, two different things. The Africans were selling something, prisoners of war in this particular case, to secure something else. If I get $20 and go buy a sweatshirt, that's not, then I buy this sweatshirt to wear, and I wear it until I can't wear it anymore and I throw it away. That's not capitalism. If I buy this sweatshirt because I know I can turn this into a commodity to make more money, and I sell this sweatshirt or I rent this sweatshirt out to many people, and I make the $10 that I used to buy the sweatshirt, I rent it out 10 times for $10 and I make $100. Now this shirt is a commodity. Up until early 1500s, I believe it was 1504, that they have the Portuguese having the first slave trading ships that actually went up to Europe. Slavery was a purchase, and it was not permanent, and it was not something you were born into. All of that is Western. These people were being purchased to be resold to make more money. So the humanity was completely removed. We have generally been taught in looking at American history that the treatment is what removed the humanity. The fact that you can beat somebody like that, the fact that you can torture somebody like that, the fact that you can own somebody or sell them and buy. It was the selling and buying. It was the fact that you were a commodity to make more money off of the money that purchased you. That was the intense dynamic, which therefore allowed the treatment. Just like if you're sailing a ship that has too much coffee and is weighing down the ship, well, you just take some coffee and throw it overboard, so you're no longer in danger of whatever the weight was being an issue for. Well, once you commodify people, you can just take the person and throw them over. And that is actually something that happened. In chapter 1, called The Gold Coast and the Atlantic Market in People, this was dedicated to illustrating the Euro-African relationship that resulted in the slave trade. In the beginning, with the trade of items and resources, Africans began to depend on the European power and technology. The Portuguese started trading with the African people because they were not good sailors. See, the African people were excellent sailors. They had sailed all over the world. But even today, there are certain type of licenses that you can get. There are some licenses that you have to either fly or sail as to where you have to always see land because you're not good enough to fly off of just your utensils or astronomy or astrology. So as the Portuguese was trying to get to India, they would go along the coast of Africa, which means they had to keep bumping in. If it was bad storms, they would have to come in and port. If they ran out of food, they had to come in and port. If they needed something, they would have to come in and port. So they never really went far from land. Well, that was how the interaction began. Well, they would trade. One thing about African people, and this has been historically and unfortunately is even true now, never been able to get along with each other. It's to this day, it's fragmented. So it was always a lot of infighting. Well, the Europeans would sell war goods to the Africans so they would have a leg up. They had metals and guns and different things the African people did. So they played into that. What I did not know was when there weren't problems in Africa, the Europeans, specifically Portuguese in the case of this book, would instigate things to keep it up so they had this regular flow of prisoners of war. Then it elevated to the fact of either go to war with me, and you know I have superior war power because you're buying your war things from me. Either go to war with these people or go to war with me. Either way, I need to buy people. And there's a lot of scholarship and history and records of these communications between African kings that spoke Portuguese and communication that's going back and forth between them and Portugal as to where people were starting to being taken that weren't supposed to be taken. So they knew when these people came, if they didn't want this group of people to go, they better had a group of people to go. Smallwood makes a distinction between the initial slavery brokered by Europeans that remained in Africa and the slaves appropriated for the colonies. So Africa had a hand in what the Western slave looked like. Africa has an array of appearances. There was a specific genotype that was being chosen or requested, we're not sure, But that was very interesting. It was a process of transportation over the Atlantic known as the Middle Passage, where the process Smallwood called commodification took place. It was specifically that time when you were taken to be brought to make more money that the humanity is now removed, because that's when you're no longer a person. There are a lot of books about did you really survive the Middle Passage? Were you the same person when you got to the Western Hemisphere that you were when you left the Eastern Hemisphere? Chapters 3 through 5 attempt to speak of the experience of the slave throughout the bewilderment, confusion, pain, fear, suffrage, and the almost imaginable betrayal of humanity within the slave trade and commodification process. The author attempts to communicate the illness, death, mental anguish experienced by the Africans as they slowly were reduced to commodities. Chapter 6, which was called Turning Atlantic Commodities into American Slaves, it offers a comparative history of an African slave's experience on either side of the Atlantic. This is a very, very deep book. I've reached out to this professor that wrote the book, and she seemed very short. Maybe when I get my PhD, I'll have an attitude too, but funny. It is something that probably should be read several times, and really is a higher level reading, even though your just interested historian can get a lot out of it. Great book.